But that raises an interesting question. Why does language have rules? Why were we taught these rules in grade school? Why is bad grammar bad grammar?
Well, when you're taught rules of your own language in grade school, the chances are very strong that what you're being taught is false. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to be taught it.
But I can see every grade school teacher about to throw an orange at you on the screen.
There's, unfortunately, I mean, all right, well, let me be a little more nuanced. One of the things you learn in grade school is the literary language. Now, in English, the literary standard is not so radically different from what, say, you and I grew up with, but it's somewhat different. The literary standard is not what I learned in the streets. It's not very different, but it's a little different. And when I went to school, I was taught the literary standard. Now, the literary standard has some principles associated with it, some of which are those of a real language, some of which are completely artificial. They were made up by people who had crazy ideas about language.
And they're all given names you never heard of before.
Yeah, and in fact, the reason you have to teach them is because they are not the person's language. Nobody, your actual language, nobody teaches you. I mean, your language just grows in your head. You know, you stick a child a young child in an environment where people are speaking language, and that child can no more help knowing that language than the child can help growing. It's just part of human growth is for some component of the brain to pick up the language. You can't learn it, and you don't learn it any more than you learn to see. Now, the fact is that the system that grows in the brain is sometimes different from a system which is regarded, for whatever reason, as necessary or appropriate or approved or something, there's some prestige dialect, and it may be different from what grew in your brain. It typically is.
Or it may be a way of trying to get us to have a common bond through language.
Well, it's possible. I mean, I think that's a problem in places like, say, Italy. In Italy, when you, if somebody grows up in the Piedmont area and somebody else grows up in the Naples area, they speak totally different languages. Neither can understand a word the other's saying. So there, when you teach what they call Italian, which is the language roughly of the area of Florence, of Tuscany, you're teaching people what amounts to a second language, and it's the national language. The same is true in Germany and
China.
Well, China is even worse, because what we call Chinese is a set of languages which are as different from one another as the different Romance languages. They just happen to be all yellow on the map or something, and they happen to be a unified political area, but there's no sense in which they're the same language. We call them Chinese dialects, but that would be like calling French and Romanian two different dialects of the same language, Latin or something. I mean, all of these terms have no linguistic meaning. They have only socio-political meaning of a very complex sort. And the way in which they interact with authority structures is crucial. So what we call good English is a system which is partly artificial, I should say, which is taught to people because it was legislated to be good English. Now, some of what is taught, it breaks the rules of any conceivable human language. That's why it has to be taught over and over again. So I don't know if people still do it in school, but when I was in school, you had to learn all sorts of complicated nonsense about shall and will, which nobody could ever remember. I mean, I forget what it worked. I shall, you will, or some strange thing. That violates, there's no, I mean, there are certain principles of human biology which determine what a language can be, and no language can be like that. So that had to be, in fact, you can trace that back and you can find out who invented it. You know, some bishop in the 17th century or something invented it and decided that's the way it's supposed to be. Now that kind of thing, of course, has to be taught because it's totally artificial. Or you have to teach people how to say he and I instead of him and me. Well, English sort of works the other way. I mean, if nobody was bothering you in English, you'd probably say him and me or here or something like that. But you're taught in the standard language not to do that. There's some other invented language which is called the literary standard in which you don't do it. And you ask the question, why do you have to teach people? Well, you have to teach them because it's artificial. It's not their language. And often it's not just not their language. Sometimes it's not even any possible language.
Why is pronunciation and intonation so important to language? Why aren't words themselves sufficient to convey meaning?
Well, you have to understand somebody else's words. I mean, if you go to central London and somebody's speaking Cockney and the words happen to match ours at some abstract level, you still may not understand them. The pronunciation may be different enough so that part of your knowledge of language is a way of decoding noises that you hear and converting them into a system that matches your own representations. Sometimes, now in order for that decoding system to work, the systems have to be close enough. You and I can do it. Actually, if you listen to us closely, we're speaking different languages. But they're close enough so that we don't have I don't have a problem decoding you and you don't have a problem decoding me. But again, that's a little artificial. That's because of the artificial unity of the English language spoken in the United States. I happened to be in England last week, and I can find myself in places in England where I don't understand what they're saying. I mean, if I listen to them for a while, we can establish communication, but you have to kind of retune your system in some manner that's not understood so that you can begin to decode what you're hearing.
What role does slang have in a language? Why does slang exist?
Well, people are, why, I don't know, but the fact is people are very innovative, and they like to do things differently, and especially teenage cultures. Why do teenagers wear different clothes? Well, you know, whatever the reason is, they want to be different, they like to be innovative, they're creative, and
so there's fads and fashions in language?
Oh, sure. And in fact, there are styles of different groups. They change, some of them change very rapidly. The words that are in one era are archaic, and in another, the era can be 3 years or something like that. And people are playing with their languages often. Again, this is not too common in our societies. Our societies, remember, are basically technological societies. Our intelligence and creativity and so on goes into other things. But if you go to, say, Central Australia, where you're finding basically Stone Age tribes, there's a lot of innovation in language. A lot of the cultural wealth has to do with playing games with languages and constructing elaborate kinship systems and things which probably have no or little functional utility. It's just the creative mind at work, you know. So you get very complex language games, a special language system taught as a puberty rite, and only a particular group of people speak it, nobody else understands it.
How does language differ in the way that it's used in the arts?
First of all, there's a variety of conventions, of formal conventions that are humanly created, but undoubtedly reflect our aesthetic capacities, that set a framework within which, they set a framework of rule, humanly imposed rule, within which people create. So, in an extreme case, if you write a sonnet, you have to come pretty close to a fixed frame. And while that's an extreme case, the same is true of other literary conventions. I mean, part of human creative intervention has been to create forms, aesthetic forms, which are somehow either appealing to us or challenge our intelligence or whatever, and you work within them. I mean, after all, painting on a piece of canvas that has a boundary, that's pretty recent in human history, and that itself imposes a framework which determines the kind of art that you can produce. And in the literary use of language is just everything from the structure of a novel to the metric character of a poetic form is one or another human invention.
Do you respond to poetry?
Do I? Sure. If I have time to read it.
Does it make you think differently? So what goes on in your thought process?
Well, you know, I don't feel competent to say, but it's a topic that has been discussed quite intelligently. So, for example, if you read, say, but not by me, I have nothing to say about it, no one pretend to, but if you read, say, William Empson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, you get an intriguing account of why poetry makes you think, in part because it's so compressed, you know. And you only get hints, so the reader has to impose a lot of structure.
You have to put your own self into it.
And in part because the formal structure itself imposes a challenge to the intelligence. If you're just throwing paint around randomly, it's not a work of art, you know. But when it's done within the framework of a humanly constructed system of rule, at least you've got the prerequisites for a work of art. It still may not be. Whatever it takes, whatever creativity is, and that's not understood, that has to be there too. But certainly I have nothing to say about these topics. I wouldn't pretend to.